Bene, Stefano, prego.
Okay, so hello everyone. I've been asked to do the speedy talk in English, so I will proceed to do so. But you'll have to handle my English for the first time after COVID, so I hope I'll be acceptable. So, as you may have noticed, on the screen you have a really big car. So the most attentive ones may have assumed that we're not going to talk about standard cybersecurity, we're actually going to talk about automotive cybersecurity. And the title of the speech is The Conflict Layer, or How We Implemented a Broken Protocol and Can We Fix It. I'm actually pretty happy about the previous talk because it gives me a couple of points that will come back in our talk right now. So, really briefly, who am I? I'm finally a postdoc researcher at Politecnico di Milano since a year ago. And since my master thesis, I've worked on automotive security and, generally speaking, cyber-physical system security. I'm with the Stefano Zanero's team, if you know who he is. And generally speaking, our team works both on offensive and on defensive security. On my side, my main focus have been offensive attacks against CAN, which we will see right now, and on the defensive side, intrusion detection systems, basically everything that you can do to defend CAN at the moment. And that's how the university, just a brief mention to the beer that we had before, which I had an issue with, because I usually don't want to drink before speaking, but I'm the last one, and the beer has finished, I think. If there's more, I will have it. Anyway, okay. Since I'm assuming that the majority of you do not really know how the automotive environment works from a, say, cyber point of view, although the word cyber kind of hurts us, the general idea is that we can see divided in 2 to 4 layers. We have the vehicle and everything that's inside of it, which is cables, CAN, and a lot of devices. We have a lot of devices, like up to 100 devices, probably tens at least in normal vehicles. And then we have the outside of the vehicle, because someone at a certain point decided that it made sense to create things that decide what our vehicle do without us, so like steering, accelerating, and then it said, also, we may have internet connected to this. Yes, exactly. So I'm assuming that the majority of you will understand that the problem is not making the vehicle autonomous, the problem is not connecting the vehicle to the internet, is doing both things together. Now, in fact, at a certain point when we connected it to the internet with many different devices and services and so on, this is 2015, this is 7 years ago. So for everybody here that knows who they are, Miller and Walasek specifically, which are the ones on the right, created the first known and famous attack to a vehicle that was able from remote to control the cyber-physical systems of the vehicle, right? So they were able to shut down the engine at low speeds, they were able to turn the vehicle, brake, stop the brakes. In 2016, they actually managed with a less famous analysis to do everything without boundaries, so steering at whatever speed they wanted. And I'm mentioning this because obviously, they did this by connecting finding a vulnerable service on a device that was connected to the internet, exploit that service to get the capability of overwriting the firmware of one of these devices. But the most important things that both them and everybody after them that made attacks against the automotive systems did was get inside the networks and send messages inside these internal networks. Because the problem is that, as you can see here, this is obviously a simplification. As you can see here, we have many different devices which are called, say, engine control or ignition control or, say, park assist, which, if you give them the right command, will decide to steer on behalf of you. And these are the problems, because obviously, I mean, I don't know if you can read this, but all the green lines are CAN lines usually, and then you have many other types of networks. But at least, I would say, almost every single car currently on the market or currently on the roads have at least one CAN network. So I'll take you to a trip to the 1980s when we decided to actually use this network. So it's Bosch in the 1980s. We do not have any kind of connection, if not computers cabled to something. Maybe we had the first cell phones. I actually don't know because I wasn't alive at the moment. But definitely, we were not thinking about connecting everything to the internet. So when Bosch decided to try and create a network protocol that was perfect for vehicles, it focused on three things. It focused on reliability, which means basically let's avoid that too many electromagnetic interferences will create us issues because we cannot communicate between one device and the other. We have sort of real time. It's not really real time, but it gets to that point. And the third point is that since vehicles are a marketed good, we want it to be as cheap as possible. So they designed this really simple network, which is two cables connected by two 120 hertz ohm resistances, and that's it. And then you connect the cable to those two. Sorry, you connect the device to those two cables, and you. Okay, give me a second. Okay, and you just send logical ones and zeros by basically considering the differential voltage between the two cables. So if we have zero difference, we have a 1. This is a little, say, counterintuitive, but it makes sense in the long run. And if we have, I think, 3 volts, more or less, between 3 and 5 volts of differential, we have a 0, right? And that's it. That's the network. Brief information on how this works from a device point of view. Usually you have the CPU, and in the CPU silicon you have the CAN controller, which is everything logical about CAN. So how the packets work, how the packets are created, how to handle errors, how to handle arbitration, and so on. And the only thing that you have outside the silicon is the transceiver, which is what translates standard logical 1 into the 0 volt differential and a standard logical 0 into the 3 volt differential. And this is going to become interesting later. Now, really briefly, how do we define packets? So how do we read things on CAN? How do we work on CAN? Generally speaking, we do not have the standard transmitter and receiver that we have on, say, Ethernet. We actually only have an ID. Every single packet that we send has only an ID that defines what's inside the packet. What we can imagine is that we have a broadcast bus, and if I send, say, ID 0x20, and I define that in my vehicle, I can decide that ID 0x20 will always have from bit 0 to bit 15 the speed of the front left wheel, sorry, from bit 16 to 31 the speed of the front right, and so on, right? And everybody that wants to know the speed of each of the wheels will search for that ID passing on the bus and then capture the payload and read it, right? So we're sending information in broadcast. We're not caring about who receives those information. The other important things that I need to mention is that the majority of CAN packets are periodic, which means that we're not really asking for things, but we're just waiting for the ECU, the device that is tasked with sending that information, to just repeat it, usually once every 100th, 10th, or once every second. Okay, this is what we need to understand the first attacks, because the first attacks are as simple as you can imagine. Since I never mentioned authentication in this, I never mentioned it because it does not exist. And the point is that Miller and Valasek, for example, in their attacks, what they did was just find a way to get to that network and then say whatever they wanted. Because you can decide to send ID 0x20, but writing down the speed is 0, and everybody will believe you. Everybody. The only problem is that, since I mentioned that the packets are periodic, what happens is that there's going to be someone else saying, no, listen, the speed is actually 50. So you have to handle that the receiver will read both your information and the one that is legitimate. And usually, your problem here is handled by sending a lot of messages. If you send more messages than the authentic ECU, they will just believe you. So say you send 10 messages while the other one is sending 1, fine. The receiving ECU will start believing your information. This is the basics. Obviously, we will have a little more, there may be some gimmicks and details that I'm not entering into the details of just because we do not really have the time. But this is the general concept, right? So at a certain point, we actually started asking ourselves, how can we patch this? How can we solve this problem? And amongst the various solutions, one of the most effective one seemed to be intrusion detection systems. And the reason for this, and actually I think the guy from the speech from the talk before is not here at the moment, but intrusion detection systems in this case really worked because if messages are periodic, it's super easy to check the frequency of something. Because if the authentic ECU is writing something at speed, say 10, I don't care about the metrics, but it's sending something at the speed of 10, and I add anything, I will increase that speed, right? So it's super easy to use, say, frequency to recognize attacks. The other thing that you can do is to use specifications. So for example, checking the payload of the packet and see whether that payload makes sense. So for example, you may say, I'm expecting that the speed, since 0.1 seconds before was 20, it won't become 100 in one single tenth of a second, right? So you can use some kind of analysis that controls whether it makes sense, an information makes sense with the previous one, with the next one, and so on. And then you have, for example, you can use machine learning techniques. Obviously, this is not implemented because, come on, we do machine learning techniques in academia, but they're definitely not ready to be implemented in a vehicle. But generally speaking, this is the overall concept, right? You can solve the problems that I mentioned before as long as they are how I mentioned them before, like this. Now, obviously, spoiler alert, they're not. The general concept, though, is, let's say that I am an attacker and I want to avoid detection. How do I have to do this? For the specification-based intrusion detection systems, my problem is that I have the ECU that keeps saying the actual, maintaining the example, the actual speed of the vehicle, and I'm trying to say something different, for example. But everyone reading will recognize that there's a difference between my information and the one sent by the previous one, by the legitimate ECU. And regarding the frequency, same thing. As soon as I start adding something, or if I try to remove something, it will be obvious that the ECU that was sending the speed, either it's not the only one speaking, or has some issues because it's not speaking anymore, right? So how do I solve this? Well, generally, the best idea would be that of manipulating or substituting the frame, because if I manage to either change the frame payload while keeping the frequency of the ECU that is talking, or completely removing that frame, that payload, and choosing to send a new packet, I'm solving both problems at once. Because the frequency, I'm choosing what frequency I'm talking at. And the payload, I'm choosing the payload. So I do not have issues with compliance with whatever the other ECU is saying. And, okay, here's the story. The story is that CAN enables us to do this by design. So we chose, this is why I told this I defined this a broken protocol. We invented a protocol in the 1980s, which justifies it, but we invented a protocol that by definition allows us to attack it. We invented a protocol that by definition allows us to choose a device and say, no, you're not talking anymore. Because let's see how it works. I need some context, some technicalities. So as I mentioned before, the idea is we have a differential voltage that goes between 0 differential to up to, I think, 3.5 volts of differential. And the 0 is the logical 1, and the 3-volt differential is the logical 0. And the logical 0 is also called dominant bit, while the logical 1 is also called recessive bit. And there's a reason for this, which is that the dominant bit magically overwrites the recessive one. So if I write a 0 and you write a 1, no one sees the 1. 0. Like anybody, everyone will just see the 0 appearing on the bus. And this is actually made by design because there's a goal of the designer. There was a goal of the designer that I mentioned, which is that of having some sort of real time. So how do I implement real time? Just, if you remember from school, or whoever here still studies that, if you remember how Ethernet works, it goes with CSMA, CD, or CA. I never remember which is the acronym, but whatever. The point is, if you have a collision between two packets in Ethernet, for example, what you do is realize that there's a collision, stop talking, throw a dice, see whoever has the lowest dice, basically, and the one that has the lowest dice will repeat that message, in short, right? So we randomize the number, and whoever has the lowest number will try to speak first, and so the second one will try to speak, but we'll see that someone is speaking already. In CAN, we wanted to avoid this because the problem of Ethernet and I think Wi-Fi too, right? The problem of these protocols is that they will not ever allow us to ensure that some messages arrive in time. And we are in a safety critical systems. Maybe that message that we're sending is, hey, you need to brake, or hey, you need to activate the ABS because I'm slipping, right? We need to be sure that even if the timings of a cyber-physical system usually are not that short, we still need to be sure that some messages will arrive when we want them to arrive and will not be stopped by other things. So how does CAN arbitration work at this point? Well, the idea is that when everybody wants to talk, everybody starts talking at the same time. And the first thing, let me see if I can show this again. The first thing that the first thing that you send is your identifier, right? It's the first thing that you send aside the start of frame bit, which is 1, 0, which everybody uses to just synchronize and start sending the ID together. So everybody starts talking at the same time. The second bit is the 0 that I was talking about. Then let's assume that we have 3 different ECUs that want to talk at the same time. The first ECU sends a 1, while the other 2 sends a 0. The 1 disappears completely. So the ECU sends a 1, sees the 0, and goes, okay, I lost arbitration. There's someone which has more urgency than me to send something, right? So I will just stop talking, I will wait for this message to finish, and I will try again next time. ECU2 and ECU3 go on for other 2 bits, and then ECU2 sends another 1, while ECU3 sends a 0, and what happens is just that ECU2 loses again, and ECU3 goes on. If an ECU, by the way, sorry, I'm talking about ECU and device are the same, with the same meaning, because ECUs are electronic control units, but generally speaking is how we call devices inside a vehicle. Nonetheless, so if a device finishes sending its sole ID, it considers that it won arbitration, and it can start talking and send the payload, right? Everybody else shouldn't. In fact, just as an information, usually we cannot have 2 identical IDs sent by 2 different ECUs in the same CAN network, although this is not actually enforced. So this is by design, and the other thing that I need to teach you, sorry, it's academic. The other thing I need to tell you is actually how the error flag works in CAN. Sometimes it happens that one ECU sends a 1, but it wanted to send a 0, or there's a collision that is unwanted. And in these cases, the ECU has to tell everybody that the collision was, like, that the packet is incorrect. So how does it do this? It sends an error flag, which is composed of either 6 zeros or 6 ones. And the reason for which we have 6 zeros or 6 ones is that there's no clock in CAN. So you need a way to synchronize the messages that are being sent, right? And generally speaking, you do this by checking the falling and raising edge of each bit. So the problem would be that if I have a payload of 64 zeros, there's no falling or raising edge, and I risk to have some incoherencies in what I'm writing and what everybody is reading. So we apply a technique that's called bit stuffing. Basically, you cannot have more than 5 identical bits on the network. If you have 5 identical bits on, for example, on your payload, what you will do is just add a 1, an opposite bit. So if you have 5 zeros, you'll add a 1. If you have 5 ones, you'll add a 0. That is called a stuff bit, and you will remove the receiver will remove this bit as soon as it reads it, independently of what's after. So even if you only have 5 ones and then there's a 0, you will still add another 0 there that is going to be removed by the receiver, in order to be sure that the receiver knows what to remove, right? So as you may have noticed, these are not 5, these are 6 zeros. And the actually pretty intelligent idea that they had when they designed CAN is that what you can do is just make an arrow to tell everybody that they made an error. So what you do is, you send 6 zeros, everybody reads 6 zeros and goes, oh, no, you can't send 6 zeros. And they send another flag on top of it. But the general idea is that everybody will consider that packet as unacceptable and will discard it. And the other thing is, let's assume you are on a car, right? You're on a car, and the car has been driving for 10 years, I think, maybe. I would assume that's an acceptable lifetime for a vehicle. You don't really often go and check whether all your devices inside the vehicle work correctly. So it may happen that one of those devices fail while you are driving. And you really don't want this to happen, because what happens is that if it's listening on the bus and say a device starts reading zeros instead of ones, it will start telling everybody that everybody's packets are wrong, because it reads something that is not correct. So you want to find a way to shut down ECUs that are starting to fail too much, right? That makes sense. Like, logically, as long as the device is not connected to the internet and nothing inside the vehicle is connected to the internet, you want a way to detach devices from the network. So how do you do this? You create a, say, finite state machine like this that every device has that tells it in which state it is. So you have 3 states. Error active state, which is the normal one. You are allowed to do everything that you want, and you're allowed to send error flags that are composed of 6 zeros. And then you create a counter. You create a counter that increases every time an error is made inside the vehicle, inside the ECU, sorry. And every single device has this counter. And if the counter goes over 128, 127 technically, then it means that you've made too many errors, and you will start going into error passive mode, which is not particularly different, because you can still talk on the bus, but you cannot send error active flags. You can only send error passive flags, which are composed of 6 ones. What we care about, though, is that if you get over 255, if you get to 256 or more, then you go into a state that's called bus off, and you can imagine by the name what you're going to do in this state. You're not allowed to do anything on the bus. You're allowed to read, but you cannot do or say anything on the bus. You cannot send errors, you cannot send packets, you cannot interfere with the bus anymore, because you are considered faulty. Now, if you remember what I mentioned before, I said that you can overwrite a 0 with a 1 with a 0, right? So how can an attacker exploit this to obtain that an ECU that he wants is not talking anymore? Well, the idea is pretty simple. If you have a way to send a 0 while someone else is sending a 1, by the way, outside of the arbitration phase, where I mentioned that you're actually going to have devices sending zeros on top of other devices' ones, but while an ECU is sending a payload, you can send a 0 on top of its 1, and since the ECU thinks that there is no way that someone else is talking, because we are in a secure environment, then that ECU will think that the error was made by itself, and will send an error flag, and will increase its counter. So your whole process will be that you discover the ID of the victim of the ECU that you want to attack, right? And this is going to be done by reverse engineering usually. You detect that ID, passing on the bus. You wait for the ID to finish in order for the ECU to be ready to consider a 0 written on top of a 1 as an error. You find a 1, you overwrite it with a 0, and you repeat this 32 times. And you repeat this 32 times just because there's okay, no, it's written here. This error increases the counter of 8. So if I repeat it 32 times, 32 times 8, we are at 256, and the ECU is bus off. And at this moment, the ECU stops talking. So I'm really hoping that demo works. It's not live, but I'm still worried that the video will not start. We implemented this a while ago. This is a proof of concept, but we actually implemented it on Alpha Giulietta. And we aimed at the parking sensor module just because it's safe, and the Alpha, like worst case scenario, the parking sensor module stops working, and the Alpha Giulietta still works, and the Alpha Giulietta was of someone. So we wanted to be sure that we were not breaking anything, right? So the first step that I mentioned was reverse engineering, and this is done with the parking sensor module. It's pretty straightforward. You attach a computer to the vehicle, you read the CAN bus messages that are passing, and you start going closer to the vehicle and further away, and you see which ID changes, right? At a certain point, you will understand which one is the correct ID, and okay. So as you can see on the screen, like we have a camera filming the screen where, for now it works. It's really annoying. This is, by the way, implemented on an Arduino, although I will mention that you're probably not going to be able to do it with an Arduino on more, on faster CAN networks, which you may find in general in cars. And as soon as you attach it, and the first time the parking sensor tries to send a message, we kill that message, we kill the ECU. And now the parking sensor does not work anymore, so if you try to go in reverse, you know nothing. Now, as I mentioned before, this is definitely not dangerous because the vehicle was our vehicle. But the same thing you can do with every single device inside the vehicle, as long as it is connected to the same CAN network to which you are connected. And the problem of this attack is that it is intrinsic of the protocol. So you cannot do anything about it. You cannot remove it. There's no way to remove this because it exploits a vulnerability in the concept of how do I remove a faulty device from the network itself. Either we remove the possibility of having the faulty device handled, or we cannot remove this for how it is implemented right now. Really briefly, I will go through this in a short second. There's two ways with which you can exploit this. One, as I did not yet mention, is super simple. We are foreseeing the idea of having ransomware on vehicles too in a while. We just have the issue of connecting to the infotainment system and explaining to the people why the car is not starting, because we can stop the car from starting. We have the issues of how can I explain to people that they need to pay me for the car to start again, right? But generally speaking, it's super simple. You will have a, how do you call it? An ignition module, right, that is connected to the keys, and that will tell to the engine module, hey, start the car. If you kill that message, the car does not start. And the second, more interesting attack, though, because it enables you to do many more things, is what I started to mention before. You can do this to shut down an ECU and talk on behalf of it, and this will enable you to not be detected, basically, from the majority of countermeasures that we are already implementing. Not every single possible countermeasure. There are countermeasures that will detect it from an academic point of view, but they're not implemented, definitely. Not for now, not for a while. Now, the last time that I made a talk similar to this one, my answer to this question, to the question, can we do this from remote, was no. That was the weakness of this attack. We had to connect to the cables because, as you can see on the right, if you remember the image from before, the CAN controller blocks us from sending only ones and zeros. Basically, from the software, you can only say to the CAN controller, hey, this is an ID, this is a payload, send that ID and payload on the bus. You are not allowed to send one single bit. You're not allowed to choose exactly what to write. However, since last year, we actually have two different ways to do this from remote. The first one is on the left, and it's actually pretty genius, although I would say it's not really real world ready. And the idea is the CAN controller, as everything else, is a device inside the silicon. So what you can do is just hold its clock state. And if you hold a clock state, the clock does not change, the device does not work, stops working and stands still in that frame where it is. So what you can do is send a message on your bus, hold the device, shut down the device, not the whole CPU, wait for the victim to pass on the bus, and as soon as the victim sends a 1, turn on the power to the device, to the CAN controller, and you will send a 0 on top of something else. Obviously, this is pretty difficult to do because you are completely blind on the bus as long as you have the CAN controller not active, right? So this is not really feasible on complex attacks. I would say in the wild, it would become pretty hard to do. Now, there's a second solution that you can implement that we actually managed to do this year, I would say, and we're waiting to publish. But it's super simple, and it actually works really easy. As I mentioned before, there's a weird thing that we do not really find in any other device, where the CAN controller and the CAN transceiver are one inside the silicon and the other outside. So what you can do is basically take the same pin on the silicon that connect the CAN controller to the CAN transceiver, and as many of you that work with hardware will know, generally speaking, you have many different devices connected to the same pin, and when you program the firmware of the device, you say which pins are connected to what, right? So you find another device, say it may be a GPIO, SPI, UART, or whatever, and you just switch them. And you say, hey, you CAN transceiver, you're not connected to the CAN controller anymore. You are connected to SPI. So when I say 1, write 1. When I say 0, write 0. And you have complete control on whatever happens on the bus. You can read everything, and you can write everything, right? So basically, this attack is completely feasible from remote. There's some limitations, obviously. But I lost the... Okay, sorry. There's some limitations, but basically you can implement it from remote on the majority of devices that are currently in the wild. Now, how much time? Perfect. Can we do something about it? Can we solve this? I mentioned that we cannot really solve the problem because it's intrinsic, but can we do something to patch it? Can we do something to mitigate it? I will propose two things, two detection/prevention systems. Probably there are others that you may discuss that may work also on this, although they are not designed for this. The first one, basically it's an intrusion detection system that we designed last year. And this is the annoying part of it, which I'm not going through, definitely. This is all the rules on one device that will change its transmit error counter and its receiving error counter, which are the actual two counters that decide whether an issue goes bus off, okay? This is how they are defined on the CAN protocol. Now, if you study them, and I did it for you, so we're not going through them, you can understand which ones you need to understand, and then you can decide what to read on the bus. So basically, I'll skip this. You can create something like this that follows what's happening on the bus bit by bit and counts alongside each ECU its transmit error counter. So basically, you are checking every ID that passes and then checking whether there's an error in that ID. If there's an error, increase the error counter. If there's not an error, decrease the error counter in the correct way. And at this point, what you can do is understand when an ECU goes bus off, right? Now, up to now, you cannot do anything else. You cannot say if it's an attack or not, because technically, an ECU can go bus off because of the ECU's fault. But you can at least, so you will not be able, for example, to recognize the ransomware attack scenario. But if the attacker wants to speak on behalf of the ECU, it will have to send IDs that are related to that ECU while the ECU is bus off. So what you can do is just listen again on the bus while the ECU is bus off, and if you see any kind of ID that that ECU was tasked to send, say the ignition command from the ignition module, while the ignition module is not active, you are sure that that message is not arriving from the correct ECU, right? So that is a partial solution, however, because our problem at the moment is that you really cannot recognize the bus-off attack. Now, I will mention another one before finishing. Thankfully, I'm actually pretty early. I'll mention another one, which is a solution found by NXP, which is not exactly for this problem, but perfectly solves it. The issue of this solution is that it has to be implemented on any single device on the car. And as I mentioned at the beginning, cars have to be cheap, and we have tens of devices on each car. But the idea is that you can implement a transceiver that checks what you're sending after exiting the silicon. So what this does is basically it has a blacklist in output and a whitelist in input that checks whether I am allowed to send something and everything that passes on the bus is of my interests. But by doing this, if I only say, hey, write a 1, it will not do it because this is not a valid packet. And this perfectly solves the problem, okay? Nice. So I was pretty early, thankfully, because I was late at the beginning. What can we get from this? Really brief comment is that first, CAN has to be changed. And every time we go and talk with manufacturers and start with the point, well, but if you change CAN with something else, you fix the issues, they usually turn around because the problem is that it's too expensive to do, at least immediately. You will slowly see that automotive Ethernet is replacing CAN. CAN XL will maybe replace CAN, but probably will have the same issues because it starts from the same point. Nonetheless, CAN is broken. You can do everything that I've done on your vehicle if you want. It's pretty easy, I would say, as long as you have physical connection. The only difficult side is getting there by finding vulnerabilities in some devices. But this is something that you can try at home. You can play with your car. Just remember that as they did not control all the side effects of CAN, they probably did not control all the side effects of sending wrong messages on the bus. So you're not really sure what you're doing and what are the consequences on your car or of your weird messages that you're sending or ECUs that you are killing. Aside that, I would strongly suggest to enjoy trying hacking some vehicles. Thank you very much.